We can start.
Okay, well, thank you very much for the introduction. And it's my great pleasure to be able to talk to you today. I do want to communicate my deep feelings for the people of Ukraine and for the problem and my sympathy and the problem of not only my university and the city of Chicago, but the entire US for the difficulties being experienced by the Ukrainian people. And so anything that I can do, anything that we can do, I strongly support, and I will be more than willing to help the whole cause of intellectual progress and dissemination of ideas. I would point out 2 points that are relevant to a discussion from a Chicago professor about Ukraine. First of all, Chicago as a city has a very large Ukrainian population. It's had this for years now. And there's even a part of Chicago called Ukrainian Village, which has a very active Ukrainian population, Ukrainian churches, Ukrainian culture. My own wife, her parents, her mother, I should say, in particular, was born in a part of Ukraine that is now Ukraine. It was Polish or Galician that actually transferred. So there was always a deep interest in the Ukraine and then the culture of Eastern Europe, and in particular this Polish Ukrainian connection, which is fluid and has been a major source of ideas, culture for many different groups, ethnic groups, Jews, Ukrainians, German settlers, and the like. So I'm really very much in sympathy, and we have an empathy here. I would also point out that at the University of Chicago, there was a leading Ukrainian-born economist named Jacob Marsha. Yasha was his given name. He was born in Kiev. He went to the University of Kiev, and he founded a whole group of people, economists working on the structure of what we might call today neoclassical economics. Marshak was somebody who was born, was actually a Menshevik during the revolution, escapes, gets a degree in Berlin, then goes on to England, and finally settles in Chicago and founds what's called the Coles Foundation. And the Coles Foundation, or the Coles Commission, is the founding source for a lot of modern econometric and a policy analysis. It's really created the whole framework for thinking about causality. I could just as well today talk about Marshak and causality, but I won't. So I will say I'm close and I'm very sympathetic, and I will do anything I can personally do, and I will urge my country to do everything it can possibly do. And I know it can do more. So what I'm talking about today may be a little remote from what appear to be remote, but it really isn't. Because many people, including UNESCO, the sponsor of this organization, and many organizations around the world, the International Labor Organization, and I would say the European Union and various bodies of scholars of countries and of social systems have talked a lot about the welfare state. Not only the welfare state in England, but the welfare state in Europe, in asking what are its benefits and what are its costs, and what should we learn from this. And I want to talk about one aspect of the welfare state that's received a lot of attention in the United States in the political discussion. We have presidential candidates in previous elections, people like Bernie Sanders, people like Hillary Clinton, and others, many others, who look to Denmark in particular, or the Scandinavian welfare state in particular, as a model for really building social policy. And let me give you some background and tell you why people do this and what the interest is. I would say that I'm associated with the Center for the Economics of Human Development and the Department of Economics at the University of Chicago. I also have been working with my co-author, who's Rasmus Landerso. He's at the Rockwell Foundation in Copenhagen. And so we're analyzing Danish data, and we're comparing the structure in Scandinavia, and in particular Denmark, with what's going on in the United States. And so we're looking for, the one mark I'd say that motivates all this research is that in American discussions, there's a lot of reference to the Scandinavian welfare state. And it's viewed as a paradigm for promoting equality and social mobility. And in many ways it is, and I'll show you. But the question is, what are its sources of success? There are many different ways to compare. There are many different contrasts between the US and Denmark in terms of its taxes, its transfer system, and its social programs. So what we're trying to do is isolate the apparent success and what are the sources of the success. So what we found is that there, unlike many of the other studies have shown in the US, Danish cohorts are doing more or less the same as their parents did, which is something which is not the American experience. But this graph is the graph that motivates a lot of research, not only here in the United States or in Denmark, but around the world. It's called the Gatsby Curve, and it's called that after the name of a novel written by F. Scott Fitzgerald 100 years ago now or so, about the affluent, the rich people of New York in that period, the golden age of the Gilded Age, I guess you'd call it, although it really isn't nominally the Gilded Age. It was an age of affluence in the 1920s, and Fitzgerald wrote about these people who were rich and somewhat detached from the larger society. But what I'm showing you here is a graph. You look at the top of the graph, there's an equation, and it shows you something that is really very important about social mobility. It describes the income of the child versus the income of the. Now, there are many different versions of this. So we can look at a single child, or we can look at the average outcome of all children. We can look at the parent, the father frequently, or the income of the family. So it's this beta coefficient here is a coefficient that measures the dependence of the child's income on the parent's income, broadly defined, the family income. And you can see that the higher the value of beta, the greater the dependence, at least by this measure. So this is a measure of dependence across generations, and it receives a lot of attention. So this is the Gatsby curve, and it was originally developed by an economist at City University of New York named Miles Korak. Two clusters of countries are really quite relevant here. If you look, for example, at the Danish countries, at the Scandinavian countries, what you see is a cluster here, Sweden, and then Finland, Norway, Denmark, which has two features. Income inequality, that's family income inequality, is low, and mobility is very high, namely beta is low. So the relationship between the father's income and the son's income is much lower in these societies than compared to, say, the United States or Singapore, or for that matter, United Kingdom, which is pretty high as well. And you can see that there's a lot of variability. Italy as well has very high association and relatively high income, family income inequality. And so the question is, how do we interpret this relationship? And economists have looked at this relationship in two different ways. And this is what dominates the discussion today in a lot of policy format. The first is the one that's kind of obvious, and quote, obvious. And that is that it looks at the relationship saying where inequality is very high, cross-sectionally, at a point in time, that basically mobility is very, very, very low, relatively low. That's the US, Singapore. And it's even worse in South American countries. So the US is not good, but Denmark and the Swedish countries of Scandinavia, Finland, Norway are really quite good by this measure. And the question is, then why? That's one measure, saying, well, income inequality, credit constraints, people can't send their kids to school. There are a lot of stories that go on that way. But there's a second story. And this is a story that's also the story that would say, look at this relationship as an intergenerational relationship. And this is a difference equation. It basically gives the income of the parents and the income of the child. Go to a steady state, just as an abstraction. So basically imagine we're in a steady state where the income inequality recurs, beta is stable across generations. Of course, that's not the case. There's a lot of instability, we know that. But I think what we actually see is that, so the argument then is if beta is high, so the higher the value of beta, you can show the greater the variance in income in steady state. And therefore, what's going on then is you simply say it's the low or the high intergenerational mobility that's giving rise to the income inequality. So that's what we want to look at. What is the story here that explains this graph? Okay. So what I want to argue, and what we argue in our paper, is that Denmark and generally the Scandinavian countries are laboratories for understanding inequality and social mobility. So what we have then is that reducing inequality and promoting social mobility is a central focus of the modern Danish welfare state. And that traditional explanations of inequality and social mobility don't hold in Denmark. And that's one thing that really is important to understand. So we need to take a fresh look at the inequality origins and the nature of social mobility. Now, what characterizes Denmark? It has a very well-developed, in the last 50, 60 years, social welfare state. Inequality in services offered is mandated. So equality is a theme that you'll encounter everywhere in Danish society. But what we see is something in contrast to the US. Universal health care, teachers are paid the same everywhere, except for maybe cost of living adjustment. Free daycare, free early child care in the sense that there's also child development, preschool, and college tuition is completely free. And also a greater social cohesion in the society. There's much less identity politics and so forth. So post-tax and transfers, income inequality is low and intergenerational mobility is very high. So if you look at after-tax income, and that's what I was looking at before, that's what that Gatsby curve is looking at. We're going to see a lot of mobility and a lot of low levels of inequality. So it's a very egalitarian society. So what this research that we've done shows is something that I think is very important, that the reduced inequality and the greater intergenerational mobility in Denmark is not due to the superior production of child human capital. And by that, I mean, if we think about the social system, the school, the childcare system, the healthcare system, all superior in many dimensions to what's going on in the United States. Nonetheless, despite the fact that these systems are funded at a high level and they're made equally available to all people, and that the level of per pupil expenditure across regions of Denmark, roughly the same, very, very same. Nonetheless, there's still substantial skill and education gaps across families. So if you look at a Gatsby-like curve of the education of the father and the education of the son, you'll find a very strong relationship that's basically the same strength as what you find in the United States. And that's an interesting relationship. And that really puts to the side and calls into question certain policies that have been advocated. It doesn't suggest that we should ignore it or that we should dismiss the Danish welfare state, but we need to understand what's going on there and why. So what I want to argue, and what we argue in this paper, is that the advantages from Denmark's universal access to services are reaped more by the affluent. So there's something called the Matthew effect, and it's named after the Bible. There's a passage in the New Testament book, the book of Matthew, that basically says to the effect that to those who have more is given. And what this means is that the affluent who already have a lot are able to better exploit the quality of access that actually shows up in the welfare state. And what we find too, and this is something that's a consequence of market process, there's strong evidence of sorting of families by parental education, income, and other criteria. So place is very important. That's received a lot of attention in the recent literature. And what's happened is that families are purposely sorting into neighborhoods. They're not random. Some of the recent work by Chetty and some of his students and so forth has really made an assumption that sorting is not made on the basis of expected gains. We find that's just not true. What we find is that sorting in Denmark is comparable to that in the US. So what this does is this sorting has strong effects on intergenerational mobility. And it leads to strong family income gradients, even though a lot of the public services offered to the rich, to the affluent, and the poor, are really the same. And what we see is even though teachers aren't paid anymore, sorting by teachers into more advantaged districts is a very important phenomenon. So even though we have equal wages, payments to teachers differ. And so what we actually see as economists is a non-wage mechanism that's sorting people into districts. And I think that's very important. So let me just summarize the argument. A central premise of the welfare state is equality of access. Equality in law does not imply equality in the use of services. And what we see then is something called the Matthew effect at work. Parents pick neighborhoods that offer better public services. They also sort on gains. They enforce the delivery of services. So my co-author and some other work has shown how the move to universal access in education, in this case, increased the dependence of a child's educational status on affluence and endowment of children, of parents. So what this means then is that one of the premises of the modern welfare state simply doesn't work that well. So Denmark has a free, in a sense of reducing inequality. So what we know is that Denmark has a free housing market. There's a lot of sorting going on. The choice of neighborhood and residence to raise children has a powerful role, and parents are purposely sorting. I think this is very important. And also that we can see the measures of lifetime influence that we use. The kind of measure that I just showed you on that Korak graph are somewhat misleading. So what we do is we actually expand on those measures using very rich Danish data. We have registered data where we can follow people over their entire lifetime. And we can follow them, what their earnings were, what their teachers' earnings were, what their grades were, what their health scores were. We have a lot of good longitudinal data that we use in this study. And so what we understand here now is that the average income, which is traditionally used, the income of the father or the household, in that relationship, that Korak relationship I just showed you, that graph, that is very misleading. And in fact, using lifetime measures shows much greater dependence across generations than what's typically shown in this graph that I just gave you. So what I want to talk about then is inequality across the life cycle. I want to talk about the within Denmark any differences, educational mobility, and intergenerational dependence and lifetime resources. So let me give you some idea of the similarity between Denmark and the US. So here's a graph that is actually very influential in American discussions. If you look, for example, at people sorted by ability, AFQT is a measure of ability. It's not IQ, it's more like a test score, almost like a PISA score. It's a measure of how much you comprehend on a standard list of questions. What you find is if you go across ability levels of children, more able children by this measure are more likely to complete high school, secondary school. So if we go down here, the less able children have a lower level of completion. But within each ability group, you see a strong relationship between family income and high school completion. So the very poorest children from the very poorest homes have a much lower chance of secondary school completion than those from the most affluent homes, even all with the same ability. And so there's a meritocracy at work, but it's also, there's a limit to it because of the sorting and because parents are able to pick. Now, if you make a comparable analysis in Denmark, we see something similar, a very similar pattern. If you look at different levels, I can't give you the test, but the test here of ability is more or less the same as the test here. We go across income quartiles. What we actually see is that gradient, that more wealthier families, so more able people go to school, yes. They graduate high school, yes. But there's a strong income gradient. So family income plays a role, even though tuition is free, that healthcare is free, early childhood, and equal levels of schooling expenditure. So a lot of the factors that people talk about, school expenditure, teacher quality, all those are equal in Denmark, yet we're seeing big gradients emerge. So what do we also see? Just give you an example. Look at the relationship in Denmark and in the US between a cognitive test score of children and parents' income rank in the society, the larger society. And so this is parental income before tax and transfer. And the US is this red line. You see it here, very high, strong relationship, much higher test scores for children from more affluent families. What is the relationship in Denmark? Well, look at it. It's very similar and has the same kind of gradient upward curve. And over much of the region of the curve definition, it's more or less the same. What we also see is something that many people find staggering and many people thought was revolutionary in Denmark and still is a subject of great discussion. There are gaps in the US between the advantage and the disadvantage. This is pretty well documented. So for example, if we look at birth weight of kids, the upper dot is basically, it says green, college educated, but it's actually very, it should be this is green here. I don't know why the color is red, but that's another story. Here we're basically seeing the structure of that more affluent children have higher birth weights. They're not admitted to the neonatal unit. They have higher sociability scores, better competence in language. There's no criminal conviction, schooling, wage earnings. We ask who's in the workforce. And finally, the acid test, what happens to those kids? How long do they live? And they live much longer. So there's all this, and this is again within this very equal Danish welfare state. Now, if you, again, the US has a similar pattern, and the Danish pattern is basically this pattern here. Look, you can see that the Danish pattern is more or less the same as the US pattern. And so it replicates in its own dimension. And even the level of the gap is comparable across the two countries. So what we see actually is a structure whereby gaps are real. And so in terms of death, in terms of labor force and the like. So the question is, how do these gaps arise in a generous welfare state? And the key point that we understand here, we're coming to understand, is that the lower income inequality and greater social mobility is in terms of income. It's not skills-based. And that's a very important finding. It's actually due to the tax and transfer system. So this Danish society, for whatever reason, and I'll show you what the reason is, right now is not really producing any less dependence between child skills and parent skills across generations. So we're saying it's due to progressive tax transfer system. It's not due to production of child skills. And that changes the American discussion. When Americans start looking to Denmark, the premise has been that these programs, preschool programs, better teacher salaries, equal teacher salary, all of these features that are built into the Danish welfare state are what we need to try to produce social mobility. And yet the evidence suggests it's not playing much of a role. And so what we suggest is that equalizing expenditure is not enough to reduce the gaps. So here's an example of how equal schooling expenditures are per capita in Denmark per pupil than in the United States. So the dashed line is the Danish density, just what percentage of people, it's very tightly bunched around the mean. In the US, there's huge inequality. More affluent neighborhoods spend a lot more than less affluent neighborhoods. And down at the bottom of the barrel, there's some real discrepancies. But so what's going on here? We've seen a lot of work, Chetty and many others, sociologists like Sampson and others have actually spent a lot of time looking at neighborhood inequality. And so we know that there's something called the Atlas of Opportunity in America. And what it does within neighborhoods now, within geographic units, it looks at the income rank of a child in the overall society and the income rank of the parent. And so this is kind of like an intergenerational elasticity, but now it's in terms of ranks. And if you look at this map in the United States, you'll see that where is inequality, where is the dependence high? That means a lot of dependence on initial conditions. In these poor areas, used to be called the Black Belt in the South. Places like Chicago, where I live, and then these areas in Ohio, where there's a lot of Black population living there. And so what we're seeing though, and then of course other neighborhoods as well. And so what we're getting then is strong geographic disparity. And that many people would say, well, it's due to teachers, it's due to expenditure of schools, and on and on and on. We can draw a comparable map for Denmark. Now the map for Denmark is, and the levels are different. The geographic, the intergenerational mobility is a little higher, and we've seen that already. But you can see sharp regional differences. These are now by municipalities, like small town districts. And you can see the coloration. These are districts with low mobility, this sort of pinkish maps, and these others are maps with high mobility. So how do we interpret this? And this is what I want to spend the rest of the paper on. A widely accepted interpretation is that location somehow, it's in the soil or maybe in the air. It's not a very well-defined explanation. Nobody really believes that, but they say it. And they talk about, the power of the zip code. But nobody, so what's really important is what is place doing here? What do we mean by it? There's another interpretation, which is, I think, better, and we have more evidence on, which is, yes, parents are sorting into different districts. Parents are affecting child outcomes. They're also picking locations. So any relationship between location and child outcomes is largely played by parents, but also schools could play a role, and peers in the larger neighborhood could play a role. And so what I want to argue is that the evidence is basically showing both are important, but the question is in what proportion, and that I'll try to answer today. So the real question is, what do we mean by these geographic-based findings? What does location mean here? In the US context, it could mean school quality. How much do you spend? How high quality are the peers in the school? Peers, not only in school, but also peers in the larger neighborhood, and the amenities in the neighborhood, air pollution, various kinds of risky aspects of behavior. So what we know is that parents are picking neighborhood. Parents pick neighborhood, very powerful. And so here's an example of a Gatsby curve for neighborhoods. And so what we see is across different districts of the US, this is from Chetty's work, that if you look at the Gini coefficient for family income across these geographical areas that roughly correspond to municipalities in the US, what you see is a relationship that the more unequal the neighborhood, the lower the mobility. Now, a high score here means high mobility. It means going from the bottom to the top of the distribution. So what we see is a negative pattern. It's the opposite of the Gatsby curve, but the measure is the opposite. So a higher score means more social mobility. And so what we see is a very strong pattern suggesting a Gatsby curve relationship within the United States, and much has been made of it. If we plot similar curves for Denmark, we get the same relationship. Not identical, but it's very similar. Many very, very similar, even in magnitude, even in level. So if we look at various kinds of relationships, we're seeing a very strong pattern. And so there's really strong evidence of neighborhood effects. And let me just give you an idea. I don't have a lot of time, so I won't, and I don't know how many of you like looking at graphs. But what I can do is compute within each of these municipalities a beta. That's that IGE beta. This is the income of the child or the income of the parent. And what we actually see then is in the raw data, this is no controls. We see a strong relationship. It's centered around 0.4, which is a high number for beta. On the other hand, once we control for family characteristics, this is not a causal statement, but just factually, once we control for family traits, a lot of that variability shifts, at least the curve shifts, and the mean beta is tending more towards 0. And so that's a very important figure because it really does communicate how family characteristics figure into this beta. This is purely statistical at this point. So more advantaged families are associated with lower neighborhood IGE, which is interesting, which means there's more mobility, actually. That's something that I didn't expect, but I'll show you in a minute. So what do we find in Denmark? That we find that sorting and segregation play a very important role, and just as they do in the United States. And I bet it's also true in the Ukraine and any other Western country. So what we see in the US is sorting. This is a measure, if you're familiar with it, there's a measure of income segregation, which is a so-called tile index. It gives you a measure of how concentrated people are. So it's suggesting that people who are at the bottom of the overall metropolitan income distribution, those people have a higher concentration. The poor are living with themselves, the affluent are living with themselves. And in the middle, you see very, more sorting, there's more heterogeneity. But what you also see is an upward drift. So from 1970 to the year 2000, which is the latest I have for this figure, that we're seeing an increase in segregation. More sorting is going on, or what sociologists and economists like Matt Jackson would call homogamy. And we look at what's going on in Denmark, we see a similar pattern. So there's a similar increase going on. And however we measure these neighborhoods, whether it's at a parish level, which is very small, a large cluster, or a small cluster, we're getting a very strong sorting about the nature of segregation. And we also find the pattern of family background is very stable, that the fraction of mothers who smoke, which is a measure of disadvantage, that smoking actually goes up. The household earnings higher, the fraction of parents smoking goes down. So that's a measure that's very small. But we also find something very interesting. Remember, teacher salaries are the same. There's an adjustment for cost of living. And yet, if we look at school quality, which is measured by the average teacher quality, we actually know what the teacher quality is. From the registered data, we can find out what grades and test scores teachers had when they themselves were students and how high quality they are. And what we find is a strong pattern that higher school quality is associated with higher parental years of schooling. So more affluent parents are picking better teachers. And this is also a relationship that's very important. And it shows the index of school quality and the average of parents' years of schooling. There's a very strong relationship. So parents are not only are sorting, they're buying into neighborhoods. And actually that shows up in terms of housing prices. So we actually fit what are called hedonic regressions. So we control for the attributes of the houses, the attributes of the neighborhoods. We also look at the attributes of the school. And what we find is a very strong pattern, and people are willing to pay up to 3 to 4% more for a price of a house in a neighborhood with a good school. And that's a very important phenomenon. And it's a sorting that goes on. So remember, the schools are better. It's not because they're paying more salary, but the teacher's salary is in the form of what's called in-kind payments. You're actually they're getting better quality students, which are easier to teach and they're more enjoyable to teach. So there's a strong sorting going on there. And what we see is that these measures of school quality, if we follow the children out of school, we see very, very strong effects on college completion, the market income of the children, their disposable income, their employment effects, reductions in crime, teenage births, and the like. So very strong relationships. So what's crucial here is the purpose of choice of neighborhood to raise children by education of the mother. And we see that parents are really sorting in a very, very clear way, that the high school students are actually then, the mothers with high school are actually sorting in a way that's showing very strong patterns. And if you look at university mothers up here, this is college, and then the university. College is like junior college. It's an intermediate level of college in Denmark. And so what we see is a lot of sorting going on. People move into neighborhoods, and then they keep picking neighborhoods. And then they go in, as their income rises, they go to even better neighborhoods. And so we find very strong effects anchored on the timing of when children go to school. So there's a very powerful effect, a very strong sorting effect going on. So more affluent parents are moving in They're moving in before the children enter school at a much greater rate. And then the exit rate out of those schools is much lower for the more affluent children. Once they find a good neighborhood, they stay in that neighborhood. They may move, but they will move to neighborhoods that are more or less at the same level of affluence. So let me skip these graphs since I'm running low on time. So family moves are not random. And this is very important. And the reason why it's important is that many people are thinking, well, look, if it's all neighborhood, what we need to do is just relocate people, move them to neighborhood. There's a program here in the United States called MTO, Moving to Opportunity. And many people have studied it. The effects have been very mixed. But the argument is being made now, oh, we should relocate people in better neighborhoods because neighborhoods are so important. But what is important, I would argue, is the parents and the environments, the peers that those neighborhoods provide. So there's a real question that is raising now in the US, and that is, should we have busing? Should we have forced relocation? Move kids to more affluent neighborhoods. If not just locate the families, at least move them to better schools. And so we have an experiment that was done in the US, hundreds of districts desegregated, but we ran some experiments and people ran the following relationship. If you look at this work by Rucker Johnson, some now 11 years ago, but there's a book out in 2015. And what you see is the following pattern, that for Blacks who were sent to better schools, that what you see is a somewhat of an increase in terms of years of educational attainment. Pretty substantial, but the confidence interval is huge, and therefore you can't say much. For the whites, there's very little negative effect. The people say, well, we should bus. And if we look, however, at adult family income of the bus children, we can see, yes, there seems to be a positive influence, but yes, there's a lot of imprecision in these estimates. In Denmark, this has actually been tried more recently for migrants. There's a huge migration, and the migrants are basically Arab nation migrants, Syrian refugees who are coming to Denmark. Earlier generation were Turkish immigration. But what we see then is that children were bused from more disadvantaged neighborhoods to more advantaged neighborhoods. And Pildam, Matana, Elena Miltana, and Helena Skype Nielsen have done this study and asking what is the effect of that busing on the migrant children? And the answer is it's negative. It's a negative effect on test scores and distress. And you go, well, what's going on there? Well, there are a lot of factors here. I don't want to say school quality is definitely improved. And in some of the American contexts, we see that the improvement in school quality is good. But remember, that's not a factor much in the Danish study. But what we think this is due to, and the authors of this study think it's due to, is the dislocation that the children experienced. These are living in Arabic populations, speaking Arabic, and then they were moved into predominantly Danish-speaking areas, and they were basically not well equipped to make the transition. So I think the real question, though, is that there might be some scope for improving migration, improving the prospect of the child learning Danish and assimilating into the larger society. But busing is not going to be the answer. It has to be a better, more nuanced and subtle approach. And there's a lot of mixed evidence on vouchers for mobility. Let me give you some study that was done here. Let me just show you one study that was done by my co-author, and that's Rasmus Landerso. It's comparing US mobility. This is like a Gatsby curve, but on years of education. So it's children years of schooling regressed on parent years of schooling. And if you look at the US estimate, it's this solid, it's this light set of boxes. You see this. And then if you look at the US, the Danish estimate, it has a pattern. It goes down and then rises. And so if you look carefully at these episodes, so why was this intergenerational mobility so rapidly increased? Up to this point, why did mobility rise? In other words, why did this beta estimate, this IGE fall? And during this period, when a real decline, was a period when Denmark was basically targeting disadvantaged neighborhoods. It was targeting children in rural areas of Jutland, which is the main peninsula in Denmark, and not making universality. Later, universality was restored. And as universality was restored, more parents who were more advantaged took advantage of the schools. And what happened then was that children, the intergenerational mobility started to decline, even for education. Rapidly, huge expansion here early on in the early years, just at the birth of the welfare state. Then a big decline, and then an increase for the Danish society. The question is why? And we think a lot of it has to do with sorting and targeting. If you target universally, more affluent parents will be able to take advantage of it. If you don't target, then you can't really see it. And so what we see is that in Denmark, there's been a real change. That's those solid dots. If we ask the fraction of children who do better than their parents, that's a measure of what's called absolute mobility, that absolute mobility rises, you can see, during that early period, which was targeting, and then it starts to fall off where it becomes universal. In the US, we can also see that that's gone down. It's also, and of course, in the US, there's a lot of targeting going on. And so what do we know? We know that money spent, a lot of the public expenditures are going to the kids who are more affluent, okay? And that a lot of the expenditure, increased in expenditure on colleges and universities has gone to the more affluent children. And so universality does not imply greater equality or social mobility. That's kind of a key point. And so what I will argue, there's a very large body of evidence. Today, I'm meeting with my co-author, Jorge Garcia, but meeting with others. We've done some work in this paper with Elongo some 6 years ago now, it's published, where we show over a whole body of interventions that early childhood interventions are most effective for disadvantaged children. And we saw that's true for, Klein and Walter show it's true for Head Start. Havnes and Mogstad show that universal daycare, the greatest benefit was for the most disadvantaged, and Dustman's found something similar in the German state. So what we actually see then is a real targeting has a real advantage in promoting social mobility. And so let me just conclude with the last discussion about long-term measures of social mobility. The traditional literature on intergenerational mobility focuses on looking at the income of the father and the income of the son. More recently, the income of the parents and the income of the children, average. And it takes snapshots of the child's income and the father's income, usually around the mid-30s, early 30s. And what we do in this paper is say, let's come up with lifetime measures. And these are measures that account for factors like the age of marriage, the onset of fertility, timing and spacing of births, and divorce. So we really take into account that life cycles have changed. One of the most important developments has been the more equal treatment of women, more change in the nature of the life cycle, more people meeting in college and marrying in college, more educated people sorting together and forming this kind of homogamy that's actually very, very important for social inequality. And so if we look at measures of lifetime resources, one standard measure is basically just present value of income. And given the information set of the agent, there's a technical issue of how do you pick the information set of the agent. We have a long discussion, done work with Carnero and with Navarro, and more recently work with Cunha. And what we've done is we find very strong effects on the structure where we can actually determine what's in the agent's information set and what isn't. For those of you familiar with econometrics literature, it's kind of a Granger, a Sims non-causality test, if you want to call it that. We have a more general approach and then just discounting future income. That's already extending the literature. But what we're also doing is coming up with an idea of looking at what economists would call the value function, the discounted expected welfare of the family. So that would be inclusive of things like earnings. It would be inclusive of things like uncertainty that agents face. It'd be inclusive of things like credit constraints. It would be inclusive of all kinds of transfer payments to go well beyond just the discounted value expected. So when we do that, we actually find, so it's a long technical discussion. We can non-parametrically identify these things. And we're not going to do that. But basically what we're doing is instead of that discounted present value, what we do is we replace the discount factor, which was beta, just a fixed parameter of a discount utility, with what's called the stochastic discount factor in modern finance. This essentially places a valuation on future income streams. And it reflects things like uncertainty. It reflects things like credit constraints. It reflects reforms that are going on in credit markets and in labor markets. And so uncertainty would play a huge role here, potentially, because you now have an income floor that earlier cohorts didn't have. So we can actually then see how this life cycle wealth has changed and how it differs across generations and what factors are giving rise to it. So, I mean, this is the stochastic discount factor. Probably many of you know what this is. This is basically just the marginal rate of substitution between consumption at time t and consumption at time t minus t plus 1 over t, sorry. And so this is the stochastic discount factor. But anything that's affecting credit constraints, anything that's affecting uncertainty, because this is an expectation, this is a nonlinear function, could have a huge effect. And so we have come up with lifetime measures, both this as well as the traditional measures. And so what do we find? Well, if you look at the traditional measures, the snapshots, and only look at things like wage income, disposable income, and so forth, that we see a pattern. And namely, the pattern is, relatively low. This is all Danish data, relatively low pattern. If we look at more of a lifetime measure that's linked to something like consumption, so it's like a permanent income theory, which would be consumption based, we see higher IGE, higher dependence. So if we look at, but when we look at measures of lifetime wealth, namely this stochastic discount factor, we're getting levels of the intergenerational elasticity that are very high. 0.6 is 0.5, sorry. Very, very high. And so what that means then is that if we look at the proper lifetime measure, how unequal are lifetimes, not snapshot measures at certain ranges of ages. There's much more dependence than we thought, much less social mobility. And this holds up for rank correlation. But these lifetime measures are very important. Why? Because these lifetime measures are predicting child test scores. They're predicting which children go to college, crime, teenage pregnancy, and a lot of other measures. It's a much tighter link than we saw before. So snapshot measures overestimate mobility. And we get nonlinearity, which is extremely interesting. If we look at traditional measures, we would see that the IGEs are going up more rapidly with the higher income. So higher income families, so higher IGE. But if you account for our measures of lifetime wealth, the one I just showed you, that the higher levels of income, the higher resources, actually show a lower IGE. So the mobility is actually greater, lower down the scale than up the scale. And so we can decompose these evidence, this finding, these IGEs, into components that are due to changes in the life cycle. When we form the value function, we can then compute what's the level of education in the different cohorts, what's the marriage rate and the pattern of marriage. You see, when you look at these IGEs and we compare a slice of time, in the earlier cohorts, people were all married and having children by age 30. For the later cohorts, they're not. And quite a few of them are in the middle of transition. Women are delaying their childbearing if they're not eliminating it altogether. And what you're seeing is a changed life cycle. And that's an important part of social mobility, especially for women. Women now have different choices. And so as we go to the long-term measures, what we see is that education, which is this box here, plays a huge role. So it turns out once we control for education. We control for a lot of these other factors that have to do with delay of onset of childbearing, the delay of onset of marriage, whether or not they're married at all, and so forth. So education is a huge main predictor. There are other factors. Other people have looked at this, these components, but this is by far the lion's share. So this is basically just a simple statistical decomposition, just taking the total differential of the IGE and asking which changes. I mean, some of you may be familiar with some work, and it's like a Laspere index, or if you're more familiar with some of the old discrimination literature, a Oaxaca index, which is nothing more than just computing a differential. So that's what I have to say today. That what I want to argue is these are major findings. We have a whole body of work. I can go into detail at any one of these points. But although Denmark is largely perceived to be kind of a wonderful paradigm for American social policy and for the world, what I want to argue is that the Danish policies are not doing what many people say they're doing. There is less inequality. There is greater social mobility, but it's mostly a consequence of the tax and transfer system. It's not a result of reducing the dependence of child skills on parent skills. And that's still a powerful role for the parent, despite all these other programs. And arguably, universality can increase the role and expand the role of the parents. And this has been found in other studies as well. I mentioned Havnes. Dussmann in Germany, for example, found in German data, found, for example, that the parents who are the most affluent were the ones who were more likely to take the advantages of child care and child development programs offered by the German state. So even though policies are offered equally, there are still substantial gaps. And it's not enough to just offer a policy. It's not enough to pay teachers the same. It's not enough to essentially spend the same amount of money on schools. Much more important is to really give people the same environments. And I mean family environments. And so the power of place, I would argue, is due to family sorting. It's family choice of neighborhoods. And I think if you look, for example, at the Danish study, sorting patterns are comparable to those in the US. And what you see is a 9-price mechanism at work, sorting by teachers into more advantaged districts, playing a huge role. And that's that sorting, which is a feature of modern welfare states, which is probably not looked at sufficiently in even designing the Danish data. But the Danes have looked closely at these findings. And so what do we learn? That basically targeting disadvantaged children seems to be a good strategy. Families are playing a big role despite all this edifice of the welfare state. And possibly it's a case that families may be playing an even stronger role, or at least there's an enhanced role for families under universality. So thank you very much. And I'm more than happy to take questions. I see one chat question. I guess I should open it. Unfortunately, it's in Ukrainian, so I can't really read it. So sorry about that. Anyway, I'm very happy to be able to talk to you, and I'm more than happy to answer any questions if there are questions.
Thank you. Thank you very much for a great lecture. It was a big pleasure for us to be with you today, to hear you. Well, we have a question.
Okay.
Let's start from the first one. Do you consider any countries that Ukraine should follow to achieve welfare because of the different similarities as you have compared the US with Denmark?
Well, I am suggesting that aspects of the welfare state, there are many arguments for the welfare state. I'm not saying the welfare state should be abolished or anything of the sort. But what I am suggesting, though, is that uncritical belief in institutions like equality of access really ignores an important factor going on in creating inequality all around the world: peer effects and sorting. Family influence is very, very strong. And it's not undone by providing equality in schooling. In the United States, I mean, we're in the middle of an election here, primary election here in the state of Illinois, where I live. And a lot of brochures are being put in my mailbox, and People are arguing, well, we need more spending on the schools and so forth. And yet we can see school quality is basically the same, at least measured by pupil teacher and pupil ratios. However, the quality of schools is not the same. And the reason is that parents are sorting into neighborhoods and their children are more attractive as students to teach. And the teachers themselves are sorting to be with these teachers. So with these students, sorry. So that there really becomes a very, very important dynamic here that we need to take into account when we think about the welfare state. So I don't think you'd want to just kind of copy anybody's welfare state. I think you might want to understand that targeting and understanding the crucial role of the family and how the family has been compromised both by war and by other social factors going on. Getting kids who are more able to take advantage of the school, all the services offered by the welfare state. That's very important. And so I think it means we need a broader notion about what the state can do and what families themselves should do. I'm not suggesting we shouldn't have sorting, not at all. But I am suggesting, based on evidence and other studies that I've done, that we can supplement the family lives of those disadvantaged children and bring them up to par with the other children. I don't know if that answers the question, but I'm happy to talk further. Any more questions or?
Sorry, forgot to turn the microphone. Second question concerns one of the possible reasons for the social inequality in Denmark and the US. After the end of the World War, second one, the US in particular experienced social unrest connecting primarily the race discrimination, namely the civil rights movement. In turn, Denmark developed in the quite stable Europe and eventually joined the Europe-like nations, which helped to enhance democracy. Can we consider such political and social aspects to be one of the reasons for nowadays inequality between two countries?
No, first of all, I don't think that's it at all, which surprises me. I mean, there is some difference, and we certainly have a lower tail. I mean, the disadvantaged populations, it's not all Black, by the way. There are a lot of Appalachian populations and rural white populations and indigenous populations that are very poor, and they have very low quality of students in terms of their ability levels and so forth, their measured ability levels. But nonetheless, I think that the race issue in the US is not playing the role that you're saying. I think at this point, I think in the US history, there was a lot of discrimination against Blacks. There's no question that in the 1950s and 60s and the 1940s, before 1950s, Blacks were getting paid lower wages, were being kept out of a lot of opportunities. But that came to an end some 60 years ago. And it's really come to an end dramatically. There may be legacy issues, but I don't think that's a real issue anymore. If you look at Black wages and you control for ability, you'll find that Blacks are basically getting paid more or less the same as whites of the same ability class. That's a fact. I've worked on that, others have worked on that, and so forth. So that's a fact. However, it is the case that Blacks are, there's a legacy there for Blacks. Some of it includes lower housing wealth. And there's also a sense in which Blacks have been kind of singled out and in some ways stigmatized. There was a whole welfare state that was built by Lyndon Johnson that really tried to promote the welfare of Blacks. So the civil rights law went beyond just equal rights. It started targeting Blacks. It started installing things like welfare. It started putting in welfare by payment, cash payment, transfers to individuals. And that created a class of people who were basically removed from the society. They were on welfare. The family life in the Black community fell in quality. That before the onset of the war on poverty, the fraction of Blacks who were having children out of wedlock or close to without a partner, in other words, was like 14 to 15%, maybe as high as 20%. It had been a feature of some Black populations. Well, in Illinois today, and in many other industrial areas, the rate is at 80%, which is much higher than it is for whites or Hispanics or for Asians. And so there is a family structure issue, and the war on poverty, in its desire to improve, may have inadvertently affected the welfare of the family and may have helped break up families. There were certainly very strong rules at the very beginning, suggesting that fathers had to move away and for the woman to qualify for benefits. So the race issue is big in the United States, I agree. But what I showed you, remember, was that, and we can remove Blacks from this comparison. In fact, we do in some of the studies, that when we remove Blacks from this comparisons with Denmark, we find essentially a lot of similarity. It's still the case that disadvantaged people are not getting the same access and not getting the same success. The dependence of their skills and their education on their parents is very high across the two countries. And so I don't think it's just a race issue. I think race is a big factor in social unrest. And I think it's become a political issue in the United States. The current president has made it his one of his touchstone issues. And to be honest, I think it's really not helping. I think it's hurting in the sense of finding race everywhere and using terms that aren't very well defined, systemic discrimination and things that are meaningless, that are really meaningless. These are, there really isn't, nobody can even define systemic discrimination. But there's a large body of research that shows, see, what many Europeans think about the US is we have this large group of very poor Black people. Well, we do have a pool of poor Black people. It would be about the number of percentage of the families would be somewhere between 20 and 25%. But the rest are middle class or higher. It's that other 75% that nobody ever talks about. And those are the people who came out of very severe conditions in the 1930s and 40s, achieved high school education, migrated north, are earning middle class wages. In Chicago itself, which has a large Black population, 61% of all Blacks are middle class. Middle class. They're not these poor people you hear about. These aren't the people like George Floyd that make so much that the press picks up on. So the story that's not correctly told about the United States, and it's a huge mistake, is the advance that's occurred. There really is an advance. And for people to say the Black population is not advancing denies the fact that 150 years ago, you had a population that was basically completely ignorant. They were kept ignorant. They were not allowed to go to school. They had no freedom of mobility. They couldn't work. And now you have a population that's free to move wherever it goes. It has now educational choices, and many people have taken the educational choice. And once segregation, so there's a very poor legacy in the South. Once that system ended, which started around 1960, Black progress has been quite rapid. And wages have been nearly equalized once you control for abilities. But it's also the case that Black family life is deteriorating. And so if we look at the Black-white difference in the US, we can't help but look at the family life situation. And again, what I'm saying is that the family life situation is more similar in Denmark and the US than most people, and that's even including Black. So there are family factors that are stronger than the racial factors. I don't know. I know there's a belief in many countries in Europe that there's this large block of Black people who are completely, immiserated and, about the riots and so forth. There's a group about 20% of very low income Blacks. But the real question is it social policy that's maintaining those people? Or is it really going to be the sense that if we just got rid of some of these welfare requirements? Look, President Clinton in the 1990s decided to reform welfare. And the reason why he did was that one of the original goals of welfare and promotion of welfare payments, transfer payments to poor people, Black or white, was to promote social mobility. And what's been found, though, is that even after his reforms in the 1990s, social mobility remains the same. Transferring out of poverty, the parents, even though the parents have work requirements and the like, those policies did not end social immobility among the population. It's not just race. That's the other illusion, by the way, in Europe. There's a notion that there's somehow all the issues of poverty are Black, white. They're not. There are a lot of poor white Appalachians. They're just simply not as visible. And it's not a race issue, but it's a cultural issue. And they live in very poor areas in West Virginia. Many of them are living downstate here in Illinois and in Kentucky. And so there are rural enclaves, very substantial enclaves. And many of those voters are very disadvantaged, no question about it. But it's not just Blacks, it's Blacks and whites.
All right, thank you. Slightly off the topic, but scratching the surface of the whole issue. Would you say that the well-being of Ukrainians will increase after the war due to the rise of patriotism and willing to renew the economy, or fall directly because of the brain drain and illnesses like physical or even psychological illnesses, and also the migration of it?
Well, of course, there's an immediate outflow from, especially among more educated Ukrainians, trying to avoid the war. There's also a big outflow of Russians from Russia for similar reasons, that the whole society has become disrupted. And I would argue that, yes, this is going to be difficult to rebuild some of these infrastructure. But my sense is that the patriotism has built a solidarity that might not have been there before. That maybe 20 years ago, corruption was much more prevalent in the Ukraine. And then nowadays, it may be the case that, and again, this is not somebody, I'm not a student of the Ukraine economy or society. I know what I read in the papers, and probably they're very inaccurate. So I wouldn't trust anything I had to say on this. But it looks like that this idea of social solidarity builds a framework for creating a nation state that's unified, that's against corruption, and that will propel. I think there's a sense of unity and purpose, which is very powerful now and will unite the society to go forward. And I think many Ukrainians who left because of the war, because they want to protect their families, will go back once the society gets to be a stable place to live in. So I don't think it's all a permanent loss, but there is a permanent loss. There are going to be Ukrainians who never return, I'm sure. And if the war continues for any period of time, they'll put roots down wherever they are. There are very many first-rate Ukrainian scholars, Ukrainian intellectuals, Ukrainian authors, Ukrainian statisticians and physicists. And, one of the great, I mentioned Marshak, Slutsky, who was a famous, he's Russian, but Slutsky did all of his work at the University of Kiev. And University of Kiev was and is a major center for social thought and for learning. So I think those institutions will be restored to their grandeur, and I think they will provide a basis for elevating the whole level of society. So I'm hopeful. I'm very hopeful. I am worried, though, that an American response. I'm not a big fan of this particular president, and the reason why I say that is the response that he's put forward to the Ukrainian needs. Even this business of sending artillery or MiGs. We're now discussing politics, which is probably something you don't want to hear much from me. But I do think that we're going to see, Putin is a desperate man. I'm not sure that Putin is any different than Trump or maybe even Biden, in the sense living in these private worlds that have no basis in reality. Biden has the same problem. Biden lives in a bubble, and so does Putin, and so does Trump, for sure, and many others, Bolsonaro, and many of these strong men live in these, or would-be strong men live in these bubbles. But I think we've been very cowardly. And I think the real issue that Americans can't face and it's current in the whole discussion, is the issue of nuclear war. Russia, it was a huge mistake for Ukraine to give up its nuclear arsenal. It was a huge mistake. I mean, in retrospect, it was a huge mistake. It was promised something that wasn't delivered. It was promised protection and security from the Russian state. And Putin, like Hitler before him, would be more than happy to tear up any document that he agrees on. That basically, that what he doesn't feel any commitment to previous agreements made to the Ukrainian people. And he seems to have a very negative, racist view of the Ukrainians. But I think what the fear is nuclear war. But in America, for most people think of nuclear war in the sense of giant H-bombs blowing up the city of New York or Chicago, huge demolition, megaton bombs. There was this bomb that Khrushchev detonated in the Siberia 60 years ago now, called the Tsar bomb. It was like 100 megatons. It's a monstrous bomb. Now would destroy whole cities, kill millions of people. I think more likely scenario, there will be nuclear use of nuclear weapons. Russia's built its whole policy around that. And the policy will be limited tactical nukes. And Russia has an advantage there. But the limited nukes will be like super powerful artillery. It won't be a widespread conflagration. And so right now, Americans are having trouble understanding the limited nature of nuclear war can be fought. I'm not advocating it, but I feel it as a real possibility. And I think, I think in the end, America has to face the same choice that Western Europe faced in the 1930s when they were dealing with Hitler. I mean, and Putin is like Hitler. Hitler, he's just as despotic, as egoistical, as maniacal, and ruthless as Hitler, maybe more so. So we have to eventually stop him. We can't say, oh, we're going to capitulate. And that's been the whole administration policy. I'm not saying Trump would have been any better, especially, but I am saying that American responses have been very weak, and that many Americans feel that we should be much stronger in responding. But there's a strong movement saying, well, let's America first, let Ukraine go to hell, and let's just protect ourselves. I don't feel that way. And I think most people who think strong, but I worry about the Western allies. I mean, the German dependence on Russian oil and gas. I mean, we're still sending oil and gas. We're fueling the war machine. There's been cowardice at a very deep level. We're heading into the summer, so we don't need those resources to the same extent. And there are alternatives, and we're not really considering it. So it's a very, very timid response that the Americans are having. And I worry that that's going to allow the Russians to continue their encroachment in the Donetsk area. It bothers me. It bothers me a lot. I'm sure it must bother you too. And but this administration, this government is very, very, it's timid. And it's also very divided within itself. They're just different groups, and there are many people in that administration that are not very distinguished, and they're not very thoughtful, and they're doing things that are very harmful, both for Ukraine and for the world. And I mean, look at the escape from Afghanistan, how ruthless. I mean, if we just move the equipment from Afghanistan to the Ukraine would be a much better position right now. But none of that kind of thinking was ever done. So it's troubling to me as an American. I don't think you want my personal political opinion. So sorry, I went on too long, but it troubles me, and it troubles many others that I know, that we're not responding very forcefully and certainly not very effectively.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you. It's very important for us. Like, we have a last short question, also a little bit about war. 1 second. Did the Marshall Plan affect such difference between the United States and Denmark because it involves large infusion of capital?
Well, Denmark was a country that was actually not much affected by the war. There were people there were people who were, don't forget the Danes are Scandinavians, they're Aryans, and the Germans loved Aryans. And they were very kind to the Nordic people and to and the Finns, don't forget, were also allies of the Germans through much of the war. So I think the damage done, and Denmark's kind of out of the way. The heavy fighting was in through areas south of Denmark, in Holland and Belgium, and then into Germany. So I think Denmark escaped a lot of damage. Nonetheless, the plan, the Marshall Plan, was made available, and it did help the Danish recovery. And Denmark, after the war, was primarily an agricultural country, making butter and meat and selling it to Europe. And it started industrializing and moving into shipping and to providing a much more diversified industrial and agricultural base. And so I think the Marshall Plan helped in that transition. But remember how the Marshall Plan worked. Many people see that as like a big donation. It was a matching program that when you put money out, but the recipient country would have to match it. And so what you would get would be co-participation in projects building. And it was certainly critical for countries like Germany and for that matter, France, but certainly Germany and Italy, which had been and Hungary was not a part of it. It should have been, but Stalin wouldn't let it. And so the structure was really very beneficial because it allowed capital to flow into an area that was devastated. I mean, you've all seen pictures of post-war Germany. I mean, the bombing was atrocious. Even without nuclear weapons, we basically eliminated, just destroyed whole German cities and factories. And so what we did is it allowed Germany to get back on its feet and created and I think the plan would have been, the original plan was to extend it to the whole region, even to the Soviet Union. But Stalin refused. He didn't want American influence. And so, but yes, it played a big role, and played a big role in France, and certainly in Luxembourg, Belgium, countries that had really suffered. And remember, the suffering wasn't all just bombing. It was also the fact that a large part of the industrial base was transported and stripped by the Germans, and also run down. So like the Skoda works in Czechoslovakia were just, completely just used to make tanks and cars for armored columns and so forth. And so there was a sense that the industrial base was heavily compromised. Although, in fact, in the case of Skoda, if you add the Nazis to the communists who followed later, the damage done to the Czech economy was great. But now it's being restored. So Czech economy did not participate because Stalin wouldn't let them participate. But the Marshall Plan had a huge beneficial effect. Something like that also was very effective in rebuilding Japan and making it an economic partner in the East. And I don't think anybody regrets that. It was a good step. And it created these states that were viable. Otherwise, after the Second World War, Europe was so devastated. And Ukraine especially. I feel there's a book written here by a Stanford historian. Maybe it'll interest you if you've haven't read it. And you probably know all the details. But it's a book called Bloodlands. It's a book about the history of this region, including Ukraine, and going as far west as Poland, say to the borders of what we think of now as Silesia in Poland. Certainly Poland, Lithuania, Belarus, Ukraine, and parts of Russia as well. And the idea is that this was an area of mass killing that went on for close to 20 years, 18, 19 years. And it started with the Stalinist destruction of the kulaks, the mass starvation that was engineered in the Ukraine to create this industrial capital base for the proletariat in Russia. That was a brutal campaign. And the area has suffered so heavily. It's an area that really, it's sad. I mean, Poland too has suffered heavily. The gas chambers that the Nazis set up and the extermination chambers, but the Nazis were no great friends. They thought that Slavic peoples were subhuman. So it created this, it was amazing, killing fields. And the Red Army and the Nazi army, they killed each other. They didn't take prisoners. I understand that now that the Russians are doing the same now in this particular war. I'm not sure if that's true, but I hope not, but I can believe it. The Russians seem to have this particular brutality, which is hard to comprehend, but Russian historians in the US have frequently claimed that the cruelty that is characteristic of Russians has to do with the Mongol occupation. I don't know, it's very speculative. I had a colleague who wrote a book on it, but he's departed this planet, and I don't know if there's any affirmation of that. But I do think that coming back to the Marshall Plan, rejuvenating this area, Ukraine really warrants rejuvenation. It's been exploited. People talk about the reparations for blacks. Hopefully, when this war ends, and hopefully when it ends satisfactorily, that eventually the Russians will be called to account and will help rebuild and help repay for the enormous damage done to the Ukraine, culturally, militarily, demographically. The Russian treatment of the Ukraine is a form of genocide. And I think many Americans feel that way very strongly. And they don't approve of what this current administration is doing in its cowardly response. But I do believe that it's overdue. So something like a Marshall Plan would be overdue to rebuild the Ukraine. But all the damage done with these shellings, it's crazy. And that, now the wheat fields are being denied the rest of the world, and the ports are closed or really heavily. And it's creating economic havoc. And it's creating a havoc not just for Ukraine or Russia, but for the world. And unfortunately, because of the price of oil, the Russians are just benefiting from all this. The Russians have not ever received this much income per month, I think, in their whole history of exporting gas and oil. So this whole war for them has been a financial boom. And I think that is a huge issue which fuels this Russian war machine. And so it's really, Europe has to just stop fueling it, which means ending the export of gas and oil. It has to, but it's cowardly because the Germans really they want their oil, they want their gas, and they're not will. And everybody knew. I just read a document from ZAB, a very important economic think tank in Mannheim in Germany. And the director wrote correctly that in the 1970s and the 80s, when the Germans made these deals with the Russians for gas and oil and coal, for that matter, too, that they created a possibility that they would be linked this way, that the Russians could use that connection as a bargaining chip and as a blackmail against the West. And they are using it. And so part of the cowardice of the West is really there. Plus, the other side of it is, and this is something that's purely American, we have the capacity to produce much, much more oil. We can produce much, much more gas. But this administration is basically creating long-term disincentives. So it's telling people to produce more gas, but it's telling them in 5 years you're going to be phased out. And that's not a way to make investment occur and reopen the fields. Fracking, we shut down this pipeline that would have sent something like 1 million barrels of oil a day from Canada down to the US. All of this would have affected US domestic markets. And we could be exporting gas. We could cover the gas of Europe. We really could. With fracking technology, we can do that. We have the technology there. It's just that there's no incentive given now by this administration for Americans to do this. They say they are, but it's a lie. It's really a lie. It's deception because they are not providing long-run incentives. And as an economist, we know when you make a capital investment, it's a payoff over many years. It's not a payoff over 1 year. And so they're harping on the fact, you know, we're going to give you more gas leases and everything for this year, but we're going to shut you down. That's not a way to produce more oil and gas. And frankly, the whole greenhouse emission discussion, it shows short-sighted. I mean, American gas and American coal and American oil is far less contaminating than Saudi or Russian oil. It is. So by any kind of realistic government long-term planning, but this administration, it's not long-term. Trump wasn't either, really. It's just about winning the next election. There's no long-term plan. So as an American, I'm pessimistic too. We don't have the Russians in our back door, but we will soon enough unless we stop it. Putin is no different, the threat he poses, than what went on with Hitler. He won't stop. If he gets Ukraine, he's not going to stop at Poland's border or Lithuania or Latvia. He's already announced he wants to be Peter the Great. So I think the question is, when do we admit that he's going to try to destroy and conquer, again, the whole former Soviet empire? The sooner, the better. It's a miserable thing to admit. I don't look forward to it, but it's a fact that we have to deal with. But American policymaking now is so short-term. So that's not an optimistic thought for you people. But my heart and sympathies are deeply with you, and I hope this turns around.
All right. Thank you. Thank you very much for a great lecture. It was a big...
Okay. Well, good luck then. And I hope if I can do any more, let me know.
Thank you. Thank you. I hope that very soon, probably, that will end, and maybe in a peaceful Kiev, we will meet and with in-person lecture, also visited all of our great institutions. And
oh, that was my hope. I've been invited to speak in Kiev about 5 years ago. I just had some personal issue, my family issue. My wife died and there was some dislocation. So I turned down the opportunity. Then COVID came and now we have the war. So I would love to see Kiev. I would, you know, Kiev is a beautiful historical city and Ukrainian culture is very rich and something I would like to know more about. So definitely, I would welcome the chance to travel to Kiev. And I hope to God Kiev stands, and I hope to God the Ukrainian people stand. So our feelings are with you. I was in London recently, down by Westminster Abbey, and everywhere in Westminster, in this Westminster Abbey, which is the main cathedral for the Anglican Church, but in courtyards, in Lincoln Yard, where the Lincoln Courts, where the law school at LSE, near LSE, everywhere the Ukrainian colors were being displayed. There's an enormous solidarity in Britain and there is here as well. There is here as well. It's not as evident, but it's here. You certainly go to Ukrainian Village, it's evident, but it's also there's a very strong feeling. And by the way, we have a huge Polish population, and they're no great fans of the Russians. I promise you, they are no great fans of the Russians. So, okay, very good. Thank you for inviting me.
Bye.
Okay, goodbye. Take care.